All right, welcome everyone to another episode of OSS Power-Ups. If I remember correctly, this is the 7th episode that we have already. And welcome to the show. Before we start with Dave, this is our today's guest with his framework Statiq for static code generation, static site generation. I will just quickly, as always, introduce you a bit to our webinar. So if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat and we will try to answer them as we go, if they fit, otherwise maybe at the end. Also, this webinar is going to be recorded, so if for any reason you have to stop, feel free and continue later. And also, as always, I want to introduce a bit why we came up with this format, which is the situation of open source in the .NET community. So the reality here is that organizations, and to some degree also individuals, of course, largely benefit from open source projects. However, the unfortunate flip side of that is that contributions back are more or less insufficient. So I'm a big fan, I always mention that, of the JetBrains Connect episode with Rachel and Aaron, where they go in more detail. And from that, we kind of can conclude that sustainability is a large problem in OSS projects, because basically the maintainers here are at risk. They face a lot of requests, updating to new .NET versions, etc., answering issues, writing documentation. So there's quite a lot. So our team at JetBrains thought we could help and power up some of the .NET open source projects. And the way we would like to go here, or how we actually been going for a couple of episodes already, is for the projects that we pick, we will fund them with $100 per year for 1 year. But that's not all. We would also like to give a platform and raise awareness for their project and make you aware what kind of gems are there in the .NET ecosystem. And also, this is always the most fun part, I would say, is we want to share our strengths with, which is, for instance, Martin does a lot with profiling. Khalid, who's also my backup today, does some great graphics. I think actually for Statiq he did something too. CI is kind of my strength. And also all of our team from the .NET advocates, we can help writing plugins if they fit for the particular project. And that's also what we did today with Dave. And that's it. We will conclude what we want to do is actually power up everyone. So not just the maintainer, but also you as a user maybe of the particular project that we will talk about. Today it's Dave, and let me bring on Dave. That was Khalid. I'm sorry. Where's Dave? Dave is not anymore in my list. There he is. He comes back. Dave, hello.
Yeah, hey, talk about timing.
You were gone for a moment.
I know. My network, which never goes down, went down right when you started talking. So I'm now hotspotting. So let me know if
same for me. Yeah, we had this trouble before. My MacBook was also deciding, okay, first camera stopped working, although I started like half an hour before, and then it had to reboot, etc. So yeah, it was stressful.
Yeah, nothing like a little last minute technical problem to get the blood moving.
Yeah, right. So Dave, maybe tell us a bit about you, what projects you're working on, what you do in your day job, what time zone you're currently in.
Sure, yeah. I'm on the East Coast, US, so it's about 11 o'clock for me right now. During the day, I actually build kind of boring line of business applications. I mean, boring in the sense that there's nothing particularly innovative about what I do during the day. But we all have to do our best at what we do. So I build really good, stable, solid line of business applications. But to stay engaged, to stay up to date, and because I love the community, I spend many evenings working on and writing various open source and particularly developer utilities is kind of the area that I really enjoy. Working on things like MS Build.
You're quite a vivid maintainer and contributor for different projects. So you just you don't just have Statiq, but a couple of others too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't seem to stop myself from reverse engineering black boxes. Most of my projects now, like a project called Buildalyzer that helps run MS Build sort of out of band, came about because I saw this black box that wasn't well documented and was like, I wonder how that works. And then just went in and fiddled with it till I got it to work. So yeah, I tend to work on sort of niche developer tools. Statiq started out that way and kind of blew up a bit and rode this whole JAMstack wave, which I guess we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah, right. It's funny because I was talking with someone else about it, and he said he was organizing a conference in 2015, I think, and that must have been like one of the first appearances of VMware, which is the how do you call it?
Yeah, precursor. Yeah, predecessor,
yeah.
whatever. Yeah. No, I had it in my head that I was going to make this huge like splash in the .NET open source community before I was super involved. So at a conference called .NET Unboxed, which I absolutely loved. It started out as kind of an offshoot from the .NET Fringe conference that was happening up in Portland at the time. So I went in .NET Unboxed and booked a 5-minute lightning talk and was like, hey, look at this thing I've been working on. And, showed it for the first time. It was cool. It was a big rush for someone who hadn't really up to then been all that involved in the community.
Yeah, really cool. Well, one question I have before we dive in. So it was called YM before, right? What made you changing the name? Was there any very deep changes or very breaking changes, let's say, or what made you pick another name?
Yeah, good question, because YM actually has and still has a fair number of users. The main reason, really, the main reason I changed the name is because no one could figure out how to pronounce YM, including myself. That's terrible for branding. So, Statiq is way cooler. But besides the name, it did seem like an opportunity to kind of make a clean break after 2 major versions and a lot of lessons learned in this space, and kind of roll that into if I were to do this from scratch today, what would it look like? And so that's kind of where I started out. The initial Statiq code was actually written from scratch. And then I started porting over some of the YM code once that was done. The biggest difference is that YM is based on C# scripting and required a script file to kind of set it up and configure it. Whereas Statiq is entirely .NET. You write a .NET console app just like if you were writing, say, an ASP.NET web app. It starts out as your own console app, and that console app then becomes your static site generator.
Sounds very cool. So I would say we will dive in. Are you ready? I will share your screen then.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, before we share the screen, let me do a little bit of context, because I know we've got we've got a mix of folks on the stream, I imagine. And static site generation as a concept is kind of new to people. So let me just give the 2-minute sort of overview there before we look at what a static site builder can do. The idea behind static site generation, and this is what Statiq really does, is what would happen if you, instead of rendering a page or a website or whatever at request time, when someone requests a URL, it goes to the web server, which then takes your Razor or whatever, renders it, and then sends it back. That's kind of the typical flow. Static site generation asks the question, well, what if I could predetermine all possibilities of this request, all the pages a user might request, all the various values that might write along with that. And what if we can take all that and basically pre-build every potential request beforehand? And so when someone then asks for a page, we've already got it done. We just deliver the page to them. And that ends up with a lot of sort of side effects, including things like performance and security. Because everything is pre-rendered, now you can stick it out on edge CDNs. There's no web server that needs to do work involved. It's just HTML and images and JavaScript and that kind of stuff. It's, in that sense, it's also more secure because you've lowered your attack surface to a web server that just delivers static content files. The thing it is not, and the biggest misconception when people hear static site or static site generator, static is not referring to the experience, right? I mean, a lot of people who are new to this idea hear static site and think, oh, well, that's boring. I don't want my site to be static. That's the opposite of dynamic. We want users to see things and things to change, and it's totally different. It's static in the sense of the assets, the files that are being delivered. Those are static because they're not being generated at the request time. The site itself can be as dynamic as you want it to be, just like anything else that's driven by client-side JavaScript these days. So that's kind of the 100-foot view of what we're talking about. A static site generator, like Statiq, is the tool that you use to build all of your assets beforehand. And then those assets, like your HTML files, get uploaded to a web host.
And the big benefit, I guess, is also you can make use of something like GitHub Pages, for instance, right?
Right.
So,
yeah. There's a lot of great free static site hosts now. Netlify is another good one that comes to mind. And those hosts optimize site delivery. There's also Azure Static Web Apps launched recently as well. Those hosts optimize the delivery of your site because they know that you're serving static assets. There's no web server backend. So they can then optimize that, and you get huge performance and stability gains because of it.
all right. Ready to share your screen?
Yeah, so now let's share the screen. Let's jump in.
All right, so here's the screen. As always, I will stay around in the stream and ask my questions or questions from the audience. And we chat a bit about it, right?
Yeah, sounds good. Okay. So we're going to start with a completely empty solution. I'm going to do a little bit of live coding. We're not going to get too wild, though. But the first thing, let's add a new console project. Remember, I mentioned that Statiq is essentially just a console app. What we're doing, we're making an app that is going to be our own custom bespoke static site generator. So that's a little bit different than other static site generators that people might be used to, like Jekyll or Hugo, where they come and ship a binary and you run the binary and that then generates your site. Statiq gives you a lot of customization options. And one of the ways it does that is by allowing you to customize through code because you're writing your own generator. So just to get that out there,
code that you also can debug, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So you can can
plus.
debug your generation process and put in breakpoints, write your own bits of logic to do whatever you want with the files that you're generating from. So in that sense, I think Statiq is a little bit unique in terms of the generators that are available. And there are a lot of them. This is a big sort of domain now, and a lot of folks have kind of jumped on board. But as far as other comparisons to other static site generators, Statiq, I think, is in a little bit of a unique position because of this whole every generator is its own bespoke generator. And we make that really easy, which you'll see in a minute. But it also provides a lot of opportunity for extensibility. So let's start with looking at something called Statiq.Framework. So one of the things to kind of wrap your head around with Statiq is there's a little bit of a separation between what we call Statiq.Framework and Statiq.Web. Part of the reason for that is a little bit of a licensing thing, a little bit of a conceptual thing. But the idea here is Statiq as a project is what's commonly referred to as open core. It has this core set of functionality that is uses a permissive MIT-style open source license. So everything in Statiq.Framework is the same permissive open source that everyone is used to. And it contains all of the stuff that someone might want to use. Nothing is like reserved or withheld. But then on top of that, there's a second project called Statiq.Web, which we'll look at in a second, which has a slightly more restrictive license that restricts commercial use, but is free for non-commercial use for everyone. But the more important thing is Statiq.Web builds on top of Statiq.Framework to offer a set of highly conventional configurations and pipelines and things. So we'll look at the difference between the two kind of in summary and brief here. But first, let's start with Statiq.Framework. If I wanted to build a Statiq app essentially from scratch without leveraging anything in Statiq.Web or any of the pre-built stuff, this is what it would look like. So I've created a brand new console app. I haven't done anything to it yet. So let's go ahead and we're going to add the Statiq app package. And because it's pre-release, we're going to have to specify the versions. This is the latest version released last week, I think. So it's just going to go ahead and add our package here. Okay, so the Statiq app package, what it does is it gives us access to a thing called a bootstrapper. And this works in a Fluent API, somewhat similar to what you might be used to in ASP.NET with like the web host builder. The idea is you can use this bootstrapper to build up your Statiq app in a single kind of Fluent API call. So we're going to go ahead and make our main method async here. Let's add our bootstrapper. So I like to do this as one method. You could do it as a block body and create an instance of the bootstrapper and then return that. But I think doing it this way makes it nice and clean. So we're going to bootstrapper, then there's this thing called the factory. And then let's create a default bootstrapper. And then we're going to run this thing. Okay, so there is my most basic rudimentary Statiq app. So
Alt enter.
Yeah. Let's add threading. Okay. So if we go ahead and run this.
I think it's still Mrs. task. But just
okay.
do Alt enter. Should do the trick, I think.
Nope, it doesn't like it. What am I missing?
Yeah,
exactly. Threading tasks. Yeah, okay. So we're going to go ahead and run this. And what you'll notice is it's going to spit out a bunch of stuff. It's not doing anything yet. This is our most simple bare Statiq app. And you see we get this warning. No pipelines are configured or specified. So what does that mean? Statiq has a few kind of core concepts. And one of the most important is the idea of a pipeline. And it's basically exactly what it says. Pipelines let you string together a series of functionality in a linear process that runs in sequence. And the reason we have this concept of a pipeline is because Statiq can execute multiple pipelines concurrently. So if your Statiq generator needs to do different things, you create different pipelines for each of those things. For example, rendering Markdown may be one pipeline, whereas optimizing images may be a second pipeline. Those two operations don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other. So you can run them both concurrently and optimize your performance. And there's a whole set of rules about pipelines reading data from other pipelines and when you can do that. And there's different phases in a pipeline, but we're not going to get too much into that at the moment. That's all set out in the docs. But let's do something more interesting. So if we've got this pipeline here, let's go ahead and switch to our file system. We're going to add a input folder here. So let's add a folder called input. And input is just the conventional name that Statiq uses for where you put the stuff that contributes to your site generation. So the first thing we're going to add to this input folder is a markdown file. Okay, so let's add a markdown file. And we'll create a heading. And writer is going to show us a nice little preview. So this is what it would look like when we were done. But nothing's going to happen yet. I've added a markdown file, but I haven't added any logic. So let's come in here and see what it looks like if I want to add kind of from scratch something that can process this markdown file. So there's a few ways to add pipelines. You can see in my completion here, I can add them directly. I can make a pipeline as a class and find it through reflection. I can add different kinds of pipelines, but I'm going to use something called the pipeline builder. That makes it nice and easy and keeps with this whole fluent interface, fluent API concept. So let's create a render markdown pipeline. So it's going to take a little action here. This is my builder, so let's call it builder. Okay, so now I've got a builder, and let's add an input module. So there's 4 phases in a pipeline: input, process, post-process, and output. We don't need to get too far into the weeds on what each of those phases does, but the input and output phase are kind of self-explanatory. So we'll use my input phase to read every file in the input folder. Remember I said everything in this input folder is kind of by convention. It can be changed, but we're going to just use the convention. So now I've got a read files module in my input process. So modules is another Statiq concept. If pipelines is sort of the broad, here's all the stuff I want to do for this one process, modules are the bits of code that do the things you want to do. So you build a pipeline by stringing together multiple modules. So in this case, this render markdown pipeline has a single module in its input phase, and that's read files. That's going to read the files I ask it to read using this pattern. But that's not going to do much for us. We're just going to read stuff. I'm not doing anything else with them yet. So we want to add a, in the process phase, which is where we do our work, I'm going to add a new render markdown module. And this is going to give us an error, and I will talk about that in a second. But for now, we'll just go ahead and leave it at render markdown. So that module is responsible for taking a markdown file and rendering it to HTML. And then I'm going to go ahead and add one more phase here and one more module called write files. Okay, so here, now we've got a completed pipeline. In 4 lines of code, this will take all of the markdown files in my input folder, convert them to HTML, and output them to disk. But we have a problem.
No render markdown.
Yeah, there's no render markdown. So this is something I wanted to point out. Statiq is highly modular in the sense that it comes and ships with a small set of default modules out of the box. And most of the out-of-the-box modules are oriented around sort of low-level control style things, like read files and write files. If you want to get into kind of templates and more specific functionality, there's something like 40 official Statiq extensions, as well as several community extensions that you can use. So Markdown is one. Basically, the rule that I use for when something should be an extension is if it requires some other library. In the case of render Markdown, we're using an awesome library called MarkDig to render. So you have to opt in to bringing that into your app.
What would be some of the other extensions? Do you have some?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
examples?
So there's Statiq YAML, which lets us read and parse YAML files. There's Statiq Razor, which lets us work with Razor templates, which everyone in ASP.NET Core is used to. There's Statiq Handlebars, another templating language. So that lets you do handlebars templates inside Statiq. There's Statiq Tables, which lets us read and write CSV files and other tabular formats. So there's just a whole set of these modules. If you go and search NuGet for the stuff that the Statiq org is releasing, you can see all the different extensions and modules in there.
So you mentioned also Razor, so that means I could, instead of Markdown, I could also put a CS HTML file there, for instance, and let that render, right?
Correct. Yeah. So if instead of render Markdown, or maybe in addition to render Markdown, I had written render Razor, we'd be off to the races with CS HTML files. In fact, one of the common patterns, and Statiq.Web makes use of this in its pre-canned pipelines, which we'll get to in a few minutes, is to chain multiple templating languages one after the other. So a very common pattern to do is to render Markdown and then follow that with a render Razor, so that we get our Markdown files converted to HTML, and then the resulting HTML that was output from the render Markdown module then gets wrapped in whatever Razor layouts we use. So I actually find the mix of Markdown for content and Razor for layouts to be a pretty nice hybrid of the two. And that works pretty well.
We actually have two questions. Are you ready for two questions?
Yeah, let's do some questions.
I think that fit nicely. So Khalid was asking, what are some known sites currently using Statiq as their foundation?
Good question. Using Statiq as their foundation. Well, it just happens that the .NET Foundation is using Statiq. So the .NET Foundation website is a great example of a reasonably complex site built on Statiq.Web that includes a little bit of custom functionality. So that one is a fantastic one to look at if you want to see what a Statiq website looks like, with some extra stuff that you add to your specific generator. The Statiq docs site itself is also another good example. There's also, if you look at the Statiq Twitter, I think it's @StaticDev. I generally tweet out when folks say they've migrated to Statiq. So there's a lot of great blogs and whatnot you can see if you just scroll through the history of that Twitter account.
I'm actually also in the process of migrating. So I was
there we go.
Yeah, I was using DocFX before, but how can I say it's exactly the point that Statiq improves here, because I didn't dive too much into it, so I hope I don't say anything wrong. But it's more like a black box. So you have a console application, but you can't really change anything. Everything else is basically just input files, and there's no real code behind it where you could add some nice little features, some of which I think we will also talk about later. And that has been a joy so far. And yeah, I really like it. And that's also one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show, actually.
Yeah, cool.
Another question, Victor is asking, do we need the SDK.Web to render Razor?
No, so Static Razor is a wrapper around the Razor engine that ships with ASP.NET. So that means a couple things. It means that everything you're used to doing in ASP.NET Razor, you can do in Static, including things like tag helpers. All the layouts work the same way. The syntax is the same. The base page is a little different. That's described in the Static documentation. So some of the things like the model, because we're not in a ASP.NET site, is going to be a little bit different. But in general, it works the same way as it does in ASP.NET. The other thing that means is that it's all self-contained. So if you add Static Razor to your static site, all of the dependencies, and there's a lot with that one, but all the dependencies you need to use Razor in static right along with that package. So you don't need anything else.
See, there's also another one in the chat, Johannes, I know him. He also says, had been planning to build a blog for ages, and Static made it really easy for me to get started with my beloved .NET platform.
Yay, love to hear it.
Lots of love here.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so we've got our render markdown module in here. We've added the appropriate package. So what happens if I .NET run now? One of the things you'll see now that we have a pipeline is the console is going to give us some stats, which are kind of fun to look at for troubleshooting. This first table it gives us is kind of a performance helper that shows me the number of documents. Documents, that's a new word. What's a document, Dave? So a document in Static is essentially the unit of work for the whole generation process. Everything in Static comes down to documents being processed by modules moving through a pipeline. So a document can kind of be thought of as a combination of content and metadata. So it's a little bit like a file, but we call it a document because it's a file plus. It's a file plus a dictionary, basically. So this first table is going to show us the number of documents moving through each phase in each pipeline and how long that pipeline phase took to process those documents. So that helps you quickly identify if you're building up your own static pipelines where you might have some bottlenecks that could use optimization, why your build is running so slowly. Then we've also got a timeline here, which shows us all of our phases, or all of our pipelines. We've only got one in this one. It shows us all of our pipelines and sort of lays them out in a timeline so you can see the interrelationship between the pipelines. And we'll see when we look at Statiq.Web here in a minute why that becomes helpful when you've got lots of pipelines running. Because they all kind of run concurrently.
Yeah, now it makes sense what these graphs are. So I've seen them before already, of course, but it's input, then processing and output, right?
Correct. Yeah. So this is going to be how many documents each phase of each pipeline output. And so that output goes into the next phase.
Yeah, I meant at the next graph.
This one. Yeah.
Which is the I.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I should probably add a legend for that. Yeah, input, process, output. Yep. Yeah, so let's see what we got. So we ran it, we rendered Markdown. I'm gonna come back in here. Now we have an output directory, which is another convention that can be changed, but it by convention, we output stuff to output. And I have a hello MD file. What's in here? Oh, but it contains my rendered Markdown. Okay, that's interesting. So I rendered my Markdown, and then I did a write files, but I just wrote out the same file with new content. So the render Markdown module converts the content of my document from Markdown to HTML. But this is another thing I want to point out, because it's another kind of fundamental aspect of Statiq, in that modules try and do only as little as possible. They're all special purpose. We don't want to make any assumptions about what you want to do. You very well might want to render Markdown and then output this as an XML file. There may be good reasons for doing that. I can't think of any offhand, but who knows? So the idea
what
is,
about feeds, for instance, RSS feeds?
yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, maybe I'm rendering an RSS feed, and so that then gets a special extension. I don't want to assume that because I'm doing one thing, I mean for these other things to happen. So each you have to tell Statiq what you want to happen for each little bit of functionality. So the way we do this is I render my Markdown, and there's another module to set destination. So I'm gonna, you can see the set destination module has a few different overloads, but one of them lets me specify an extension or entire path. So if I just do an extension, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to take all of the inputs that I read, I'm going to render those to Markdown, and then for every single one, I'm going to go ahead and change the extension to HTML. So now when it comes to the write files module, that destination for the document has an HTML extension. And so this is another good example of how documents flow through. We've got 4 modules in our pipeline now at varying phases of the pipeline. And each one is going to take the document from the previous phase, or documents, and do something to each of those documents and then output the result. And so the documents are going to kind of flow through here module by module, each module changing them a little bit. And so when we come back here, we can see after running it now, I actually get the HTML file in my output that I was expecting to see. So that's how we build up in Statiq.Framework a pipeline kind of totally from scratch.
Good question here from Dylan. Can process modules explode one document into multiple?
Yes, yeah. In fact, there is, let me just show you very quickly here, because right now, the easiest way to see the available modules, and this won't be the case forever, but for now, the easiest way to look at the modules that are available is to come in.
Can you zoom in a bit?
Yes, I can do that.
Yeah,
there we go. Okay, so I'm on the Statiq.Framework GitHub site, and I opened up the SRC core Statiq core modules folder. And so we've got modules in several different categories. But the question is, can a module explode a document into multiple modules? There's a bunch of modules in what I call control that do that and more. We have modules that do all kinds of things. We can combine documents into a single document. We can create documents by taking a document and extracting information. We can clear the documents. I can enumerate values from a document and spit out additional documents. This is that explode scenario. So one way you might use this is if you have a document with some metadata. Usually I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. We usually use something called front matter, which lets you put YAML or JSON in your file, above the file. And that then gets translated into metadata for the document. So if I have like an array, I can use this module to take that and output one document per value. So take one document and explode it into multiple documents. We can filter our documents, we can group them, we can add conditionals, we can order and paginate them. So you can see there's all these modules that help us manipulate the documents as they flow through. And not all of them are this sort of convert the content style. There's modules that do all kinds of stuff. Eventually, the Statiq docs will have API documentation for all of these. which this is a good segue. I was going to talk about this in the end, but I'll talk about it now. So we've talked about Statiq.Framework. In just a second, we'll talk about Statiq.Web. There is a third Statiq project that is being incubated right now called Statiq.Docs. YAM, the predecessor, had built-in support for generating API documentation from .NET assemblies or source code. And it could go through and basically take an API and spit out, what you might be used to seeing from something like docfx. Spit out, API documentation for it. This functionality is coming to Statiq. It's just been a little bit long time coming because porting the layout that supports this from YAM to Statiq has been a little bit tricky with some of the breaking changes.
I'm already looking forward to that, actually.
Yeah, no, I know. We've got a lot of folks looking forward to this. Because
it's the one last bit, I think, that that docfx has. I mean, at least from what I wanted to use. And that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is coming. And eventually when this comes, we'll end up with a page very similar to this one from YAM that lists all of the modules, if they come from an extension, what they do, and so on. So that's something I look forward to. For now, if you want to see the Statiq modules, you have to go to the repo and look at them, or rely on IntelliSense or something. Or ask me on Twitter, and I can help. I'll be human module documentation.
Here, everyone. Dave said follow Statiq Dev on Twitter and ask your questions.
Okay, so let's go to Statiq.Web. So let's create an entirely new project here. Oh, I'm in the file system. Add a new project. And we'll start from scratch. We'll create the Statiq.Web project. So same, I'm going to build a console app convention. That part is the same. The difference, though, is that we're going to go ahead and, instead of adding the Statiq app package, I'm going to add the Statiq.Web package. And there's actually .NET new templates for all this as well. I'm doing it kind of longhand here so you can see what's going on under the hood. But if you want to get this going really quickly, you can download and run the .NET new template for Statiq, which will basically do what we're doing right now for you. So I installed the Statiq.Web package. Let's go ahead and just add that using statement for us, because I know we're going to need it. There, now it won't shout at me.
There should be a context action for that. I see that. I mean, turning sync main to async main.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna write this similar to what we did before. I'm gonna await a bootstrapper. Same deal as Statiq.Framework. Gonna get the factory for the bootstrapper. This factory thing is a little bit of an extra step, but it's necessary for some very obscure reason that I can't even remember offhand. But we need to essentially use this factory static property to get our bootstrapper instance. But so now instead of create default, you'll notice I have an extra call here, create web. So when in Statiq.Framework I do a create default, it rigs up a handful of conventions like that input folder and output folder we talked about. When I do create web, I'm rigging up a whole bunch of conventions. So I'm going to just go ahead and .NET run this. You remember when I ran the Statiq.Framework app after doing my bare bones, I got nothing. I got a warning that said you don't have any pipelines. Watch what happens when I run it now after adding Statiq.Web. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pipelines now without doing anything. So what's going on here? What in the world?
I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, so in Statiq.Web, the idea, it kind of flips the concept on its head. Statiq.Framework, you're building up your bespoke static generator from scratch by building your pipelines, adding modules to them, and having it do exactly what you want it to do. Statiq.Web takes the position of, I'm going to try and pre-configure through conventions and settings everything you might possibly want to do to build a website. So Statiq.Web is somewhat analogous to your Jekyll or your Hugo or your Gatsby or your other sort of off-the-shelf static generators. So it creates all of these extra pipelines for you that do most of what you could imagine doing. And some of these pipelines get a little bit crazy in terms of removing work from your code and putting it into your files. What I mean by that is some of the things we can do in Statiq.Web are, for example, I can add a to an input folder here. I can add a .cs file. I can add a straight up C# script file. Statiq.Web knows how to read that. It'll read it, execute it, and whatever you return from that as a string will end up as your document content. I can do these things called archives, which lets me, just by writing some YAML, go and fetch documents from other places and combine them and spit out things like tag clouds and you know, that's for like blogs when you've got your set of tag archives. You can do all that from a single YAML file. You know, so Statiq.Web has all this crazy stuff built into it that would be complicated to build from scratch in Statiq.Framework, and so that's kind of where the difference is.
Now I have the question for the C# file. Do you have any real-world example already where this is being used?
Yes. So now that you mention it, I actually did this and tweeted about it. The tweet's on the Statiq account somewhere. But I had a real-world situation at the day job where we had enums. We have a ASP.NET Web API, and it has a bunch of enums, and those were getting out of sync with our front end. And we have a Vue JavaScript-based front end. The front end is generated by Statiq. So we've got this Vue front end that uses single file components and all the good Vue stuff, your typical Vue JavaScript. But we had this issue where we were defining the enums and their values coming over from the web API in JavaScript files. And the stuff on the server kept getting out of sync with the stuff on the client. We'd add an enum value to the server and forget to update the one in JavaScript to add the new value. So then the API would send over the numeric value for that enum, and we wouldn't have it on the client, and so things would blow up. So
okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the question became, well, how can we fix that? And the solution I came up with was because we're generating the front end with Statiq, I wrote a very small C# CSX file in the Statiq input folder that used reflection, reflected over all of the enum types in the web API project, and built up a string with a JavaScript file that contained a JavaScript version of all of those enums, and then wrote it to disk as part of the generation process as a JS file that we can include. So now every time we build the front end, it has an updated set of JavaScript enum definitions that match what's on the back end.
That's really cool, because you also have this single source. You follow the single source of truth how to say,
Right.
idea, basically. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you
and there's a
don't
couple
get out of
ways you could
sync.
have
That's
done
great.
that in
Yeah.
Statiq. I mean, we could have written a custom module that would have done the same thing. But because
But
we're
with a
using,
bit of parsing probably also, right?
yeah, exactly. You know, it's fun to, the idea in Statiq.Web is we're trying to take as much out of the C# code. And there's nothing wrong with doing stuff in the C# code. That's certainly the most powerful way of doing it. But we're trying to provide an alternative where we're taking as much out of that and putting it into files in your input folder as we can. So that your site generation becomes driven by your input files as opposed to source code. And so maybe one of your input files, like in this case, is source code, and that's okay.
Right.
But it kind of it creates this nice set of inputs where you don't really ever have to look at the app code again. So let's go back to the file system here just to kind of show this working. I'm going to add I'm going to add my input folder here. And let's just copy over my hello markdown file. Okay, so now I don't have to add anything. I've still got the same, my static web is still just the bootstrapper with the create web. I'll go ahead and run this. And the built-in functionality in Statiq.Web is going to do essentially what we did up above, but in a much more complicated way, because there's all this. Statiq.Web introduces concepts like content type and media type that let you create a lot of fine-grained control over how files are interpreted and dealt with. But by default, it's going to see this markdown file, see that it's a markdown media type that triggers the render markdown module, which outputs an HTML file. And you can see we also get an extra output file for free here. Now that I have an input file, one of the things Statiq.Web does is it automatically generates sitemaps. So it's going to spit out my sitemap here for me as well. So let's look at something else that Statiq.Web does real quickly. One of my favorite features, because it removes a lot of typing. When I talk about something called shortcodes. So every templating language, Markdown, Razor, Handlebars, Liquid, all templating languages have their own set of functionality, right? They all have calls that you can make that do different things. And some of them can spit out certain kinds of HTML from those calls. Some of them have libraries. Razor has a bunch of libraries written for it that interface with things like Bootstrap and spit out Bootstrap-styled HTML. But what if we want a common language for generating content in a file, regardless of whatever templating language or anything like that? That's essentially what someone said that output is not valid HTML. Yes, you are correct. We're missing our HTML tag. We're missing our body tag. All we're doing is rendering the markdown. So if we want valid HTML, we'd probably have to surround it with a Razor layout that had the rest of the HTML around it.
Is that also something that maybe is inside the .NET template? Or is that a bit more bare bone?
Yeah, so you mean the .NET New template for Statiq.Web?
Yeah, right.
The .NET New template for Statiq.Web essentially sets you up with this.
Okay.
So we're starting, once you run that template, you're starting about from where we're at now. The idea, this gets back to Statiq, even Statiq.Web, not making too many assumptions. I don't want to assume that you mean to output a fully formed HTML file. There may be perfectly good reasons, like maybe client-side includes, that you want your HTML to be a fragment instead of a full HTML file. Right. If you want a full HTML file, you have to use layouts that would do that for you.
And maybe a good example of that is the Statiq.Dev website itself, right? So
correct.
That was actually what I was using. I just forked it and applied a couple of my own changes, and just observe what's happening. But this is a good example because it also uses the whole thing in combination with Razor already.
Yeah, and there's also things called themes, which we're not even going to talk about today because we don't have time. But a theme, if Statiq.Web builds in a set of default pipelines, a theme builds in a set of default input files. That's kind of a good way to think about it. So when you bring in a theme, you're going to bring in a whole bunch of input files kind of behind the scenes for things like layouts and archives and that kind of thing. So we're not going to get into that at all, but just know that they exist, that there is this thing called themes that you can use that will introduce things like layouts and other functionality, depending on the kind of site you're trying to build. But so let's get back to our markdown file here. So we're going to look at shortcodes. Shortcodes are a concept that I borrowed from Hugo, and I love the way Hugo did shortcodes, so I tried to kind of do something similar. Essentially, a shortcode is a way to run a little mini module in line with your content. It says, take the stuff in this shortcode, run it through this block of .NET code, and whatever you return from that is what we're going to put in the content at this place. So one thing that I always have trouble remembering how to do is a figure in HTML. So I'm going to add a figure shortcode here. Let's say I've got an image and assets. I don't really, but that's okay. It's not going to look for it at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and create a figure shortcode. Okay, let's turn off the preview. Oh, that's cool. I actually didn't know we'd do that. So you'll notice shortcodes have this weird syntax. This required a lot of trial and error to find a good syntax, because what this actually is what's called XML processing instruction. And the reason this syntax looks weird is because it's actually valid XML. It got inherited by HTML standards, and because Markdown processes XML and HTML elements and kind of knows about processing instructions, it also ignores this. The idea here is that this processing instruction is essentially ignored by most web-based templating engines. So to the Markdown processor, this is going to be invisible. It'll just pass right on through as is. And so then the shortcode processor can see it and pick it up. That's not really important, but I just point it out because the syntax looks goofy if you're not used to it.
Yeah, right. That's actually something. Yeah, like I mentioned at the beginning, we always want to provide a bit more support for the projects that we have here, and exactly that thing with the shortcodes. I mean, I totally get the idea behind it, so that it gets ignored from all the different languages that you basically use. Yeah, but what I did before was basically always going to a place where I used it, copy it, and then change what I need to change, right? So what I really wished for here was some template, and I think Dave already has it installed. So that's a tiny bit what we did in the plugin. Maybe we can provide something more.
Hey, look at that.
We will see.
I have a writer plugin called Statiq Support. That's cool. How'd that get there?
Yeah, and you even have it installed.
Yeah, it's installed. Look at that. So, I mean, so this is really hard to remember. If I can spell it right. Oh, look at that. So one of the things the plugin currently does is it gives me a live template in Writer. So if I type figure, you can see it pops up my little live template tooltip here. I can tab complete, and now I've got my my nice figure shortcode syntax all set and ready to go.
Actually, what I planned here was to have the assets as a default value, that you can just use right arrow key to append whatever you need. But I figure I figure there must be some issues. So definitely we will also show another one, I think, very briefly. But we can extend this set of live templates pretty easily. And from what I used it for, it's helpful. So I don't need to, all this boilerplate tagging, tag stuff.
Yeah. No, it's awesome. So now I've added a couple figures. I don't have to remember the syntax. I'm in a Markdown file, so HTML syntax gets a little goofy in Markdown anyway. Mm-hmm. So let's see what happens when I run with this shortcode in here. You can see when I open up my HTML now, it expanded to a standard HTML figure element with my image and caption. So that's just a quick little look at what these things called shortcodes do. There's a number of built-in shortcodes, but more importantly, shortcodes are a really easy extensibility mechanism. It's probably one of the easiest ways to get started with extending Statiq and Statiq.Web is to build a shortcode.
I have one question. Or is it very, very much a side thought? I think this. I mean, in Markdown you can also specify to include images, etc. But as far as I know, they don't support this having a how do you call it, caption for an image, right?
Yeah, I think that depends on the Markdown flavor. Right? Yeah. There's Markdown is Markdown, and there's like 10 different dialects. And so depending on which Markdown processor you use, some have varying degrees of caption and figure support. I think MarkDig actually does have either an extension or right out of the box support for figures as well. But there's another way to do it, and the shortcodes work in Statiq across any template. So I could have done this in a Razor file. I could have done it in a Liquid template, and it works the same way everywhere. So it helps standardize things. And so one last shortcode thing to show is something you worked up here. We'll pop it open. I said shortcodes are really easy to build.
I can confirm.
Yeah, here's a shortcode. So you can build. There's varying methods in the Bootstrapper for building shortcodes. There's one that lets you build it right in your Fluent Bootstrapper API as a delegate. That you can just write it right there in your program CS. I like to write it as a class more because I find that easier to maintain, and you can add tests and stuff if you really want to. But if you build it out as a class, just derived from either shortcode or sync shortcode, depending on if your shortcode makes async calls or not. And then you just override a single method, which includes your shortcode arguments. The content, that's the part that appears inside your shortcode beginning and ending blocks, and include some other stuff like the document that you may or may not need access to. But the idea here is you go through and then you just return a shortcode result, which can be a string, or if you want to get really fancy, shortcodes can also manipulate the document. Which is kind of a power move if you want the shortcode to add like metadata. So that's really all there is to it. So this shortcode takes it's called alert, and it'll take a color and generate a alert div and spit that out to the rest of your content there.
So there are also a couple of derived types, right? Underneath, like it's basically the Bootstrap alert.
Oh, look at that! That's I love how you did this. I actually didn't see the derived ones in here. Yeah, so now we've got a whole set of shortcodes: primary, secondary, success, which all derive from this base alert shortcode and would all spit out the appropriate alert div. Yeah, awesome.
There are also live templates already for that. Although they are not in Statiq yet.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe we can make it a pull request or something.
Yeah.
You can also let me know if you want something different, or whatever you want. We do have a couple of questions. I didn't forget
let's
about
get to
it.
I know some questions have been piling up here.
Yeah, I did not forget about it, but it was not the right timing. So let's start with an easy one. So Imo was asking, can Statiq be used with GitHub Pages? We mentioned that already. So really, there was no issue at all. I'm currently using it already, so it works great. Khalid had a couple of interesting questions too. The boilerplate bootstrapping with a program CS file. He's asking if with the recent additions for .NET, like top-level statements, implicit global usings, will you apply those for the template maybe? Or what are your
that's
thoughts
a good
about
question.
it?
Yeah, so if we use the .NET New template and kind of went all in, I don't even know what would that look like. It might look like this, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, true.
I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I'm going to have to think on that one. My guess is probably yes, but we'll give it a little bit of time for people to become used to this. Because what I don't want to have happen is for someone to run the template and open up the resulting file and be like, "What is this?" So we'll probably let the community catch up a bit before we kind of go all in on the top level statements and things like that.
But you're also in the lucky position, like I have this in one of my projects. You don't have a base class, so with a base class, I think you would not be able to use those. Like if program would need to derive from some other type for infrastructure purpose or something. But yeah, you're in a good position with that.
Yeah.
Another question: does running static in debug or release affect the build performance?
Good question. I would guess that running it in release is probably faster, if only because it's a .NET console app. So whatever optimizations you're going to get with any .NET console app in a release build are going to apply here. Yeah, so I haven't actually benchmarked one versus the other, but I have to think that a release mode would be faster.
Okay. One question for me in this case, actually, does the JetBrains Writer plugin scan the project for custom shortcodes to help you when modifying Markdown? Unfortunately not. So also for those that are interested a bit in Writer and ReSharper plugins, so what they've showed with the figure live template, that's actually in front-end code. So some of you may know with ReSharper and Writer, you can define C# live templates in a file which is called .settings. But for Markdown, because Markdown is handled from the front end, from the IDEA part of Writer, IntelliJ IDEA part, it's basically an extension to the front end, and it's written in XML files here in this case. We will see what we can do in terms of that, but as far as I would say here is, if you remember the shortcodes, which shortcodes are there, then you can just use the live templates, and you can actually also browse them, Dave. If you want, you can go to settings. Maybe that's a good point, just for everyone to find out where they have to look. And under editor, the pro. No, that's the pro way actually. But under live templates, there's at the very end, there's other languages, and here in the Markdown. And Markdown should show all the live templates that are currently available. Like I said, we can extend those. Dave, you can just throw me a bunch of links, and I will add anything that you would like to have. And
well, hey, Hacktoberfest is coming up soon. Got my Hacktoberfest shirt on. Yeah,
that too. Okay, another question. and I actually have to scroll through again to just see if I didn't miss anything. Is there a shortcut for syntax highlight?
Yes. So
or code snippets?
I am glad you asked this.
Yeah, me too.
Because yeah, I mean, for one, it's a cool thing to have, but also I think it highlights how many static extensions are already available kind of officially off the shelf, because I got your back. There is a official static highlight extension, which includes a highlight code module, which can do that in a module way, and a highlight shortcode. So when we run the highlight code module, this will find code blocks, basically pre-code elements in HTML, and add syntax highlighting to them. Or if you want to do it directly as a shortcode, you can, there's a highlight shortcode that'll do it as well. And what these shortcodes do, so syntax highlighting is kind of an interesting thing because it relies on coordination between the generator and the client. Most highlighters highlight on the client by using CSS rules. So you need something that can create those CSS rules for your code block. A lot of people do that entirely on the client. They'll have a code element, an HTML code element with some code in it, and then they run a JavaScript app on the client that finds at runtime on the client, finds your code elements and then inserts your CSS rules into the DOM as appropriate. What this lets you do, because that can be time consuming, especially if you have a lot of code, this will move that work to your generator process. And so when either the highlight shortcode is done or the highlight code module is done, what you end up with is a set of HTML that already has spans with those CSS rules for highlight.js already applied. So then you don't need to run highlight.js on the client. You just need to get your highlight.js syntax highlighting style sheets. Hopefully that made sense. This whole when things happen can start to kind of bend your brain a little bit. In this case, we're taking a code block and doing what you would normally do on the client, doing it at generation time to add those CSS rules.
I have one follow-up question for that and one more note also. Well, what I was missing currently, and I've checked a blog from I don't remember the name, but what I would be missing is a copy button for code snippets. That would be nice.
Yeah. So now we're really talking about an interesting coordination, because when we start getting into things like can I make it do Bootstrap or Tailwind, or can I make my code snippet behave this way on the client? That's one of the ways where themes come in, because we've got this. You start ending up with this weird coordination between what's available on the client in terms of style sheets and whatever CSS framework I used and whatever JavaScript is there, and what Statiq is generating, and what you're bringing in is raw assets, right? You might have a LESS or a SAS file that's being converted to CSS and included in your output. So like one of the things that's been talked about, which you've kind of gotten a jump start here with those alert shortcodes, is what would it look like if someone created a shortcode library for Bootstrap, so that if you knew your Statiq website or you had a theme that was using Bootstrap, you could bring in the Bootstrap set of shortcodes and start generating Bootstrap styled elements from those shortcodes. Or what if you're doing Foundation instead? Okay, so I'll swap out the Bootstrap shortcode library for the Foundation shortcode library. And now I've got a set of similar shortcodes, but they're spitting out Foundation-styled HTML instead of Bootstrap HTML. So there's a lot that can be done there in terms of customization for whatever it is you're doing on the client. Personally, I have a bunch of sort of internal personal use modules and shortcodes that are tailored towards Vue. I have a
Open source?
No, not yet, because they're they're specific right now.
Very specific. Okay.
Yeah, but like I have one that scans my input folder for single file components, and then does stuff with those in the output so that they're always available.
Okay,
gotcha. So you can build up these libraries that kind of coordinate with what you're doing in terms of raw assets on the client, that help your generator output the right stuff. So okay. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I have one more thing to show. Do we want to show a non-web thing?
Well, we have like 15 minutes. Would that work?
Okay, yeah, we'll be quick here. So,
but I have one more thing.
Okay.
Maybe a question for you. Do you know Simon Kropp's Markdown Snippets project?
I do. Yeah, I'm a fan.
Yeah. So that is actually something I would put it here, but I will still formulate it as a question. I think it would be a really nice fit to use Statiq with those together, because what it does is you can reference snippets inside your Markdown files for Statiq, and the snippets, the code examples that you want to use could be coming from another repository, a repository that actually has those as normal code files, where you can make sure that everything compiles, even everything works, and it's like living code, basically, living documentation as code, more or less. And I think that would be a great addition. I would try to use it in combination with Statiq pretty soon, and yeah, just for everyone who's interested.
Yeah, I'd love to see how that might be integrated, what that would look like. Okay, so what I've started to do here while you were talking, because this is a little bit of text I've got to type, I'm creating a JSON file in my input folder called files.json, and I'm using it to, you can probably guess, I'm defining some files here. There's nothing particularly special. This isn't like some kind of static convention. This is just a normal JSON file. I could have called these whatever. So I've written a JSON file here. And so we're going to add a new pipeline to, I went back to my Statiq.Framework project, by the way. I'm no longer in Statiq.Web. I'm now back to a Statiq.Framework, build it all yourself. This is my bespoke generator all the way. So I'm going to change my one markdown pipeline a little bit so that we don't get confused. I'm going to have it only open markdown files for the render markdown pipeline. And I'm going to build a second pipeline. Let's call this one generate files. Okay, so for the generate files module, I'm going to go ahead and read. So what I'm doing here, I just want to demonstrate a pipeline that really has nothing to do with web stuff. One of the things that's been kind of a revelation for me, dogfooding this tool, is that you can use Statiq for things that have nothing to do with the web. And so I've actually written and used a number of little utilities that are based on Statiq, if only because the built-in modules that ship out of the box provide a lot of neat functionality that eliminates some code you have to write if you're doing file processing type things. So I'm going to write a module here that doesn't really do anything with the web, and you can envision if this pipeline, sorry, I'm going to write a pipeline. If this pipeline were on its own without the render markdown one, this whole app would now be a utility as opposed to a web generator. So I'm going to go ahead and for the second pipeline, we're going to read my JSON file. I'll read that specifically by name. Now let's add some process modules, and we're going to add a bunch of process modules this time. So I'm going to add the parse JSON module. That takes a JSON file and results in a document that has the structure of the JSON file in metadata. And I'm going to do another module, which I briefly talked about earlier, called enumerate values. And so this gets back to what someone asked before, but you had no idea your question was going to become so relevant. Can you explode a document? That's exactly what we're doing here. In my files JSON, I have this top level property called files, and it's an array with 2 items. So then inside my pipeline, I'm going to take that files JSON file, which I read in and parsed. And because the top level properties become metadata in the document that gets returned from parsed JSON, now that return with files as a key in that document gets passed to enumerate values. So we're going to read that. And since it's an array, I'm going to get 1 output document per item in that array. So this is going to now result in 2 documents, 1 for each of the items in this array. So now I've got 2 documents flowing into my next module. So we're going to do a quick set content here. I'm going to do some stuff that may look a little bit weird. We didn't really talk about it, but there's this config class, which has a whole bunch of these from whatevers. The idea is a lot of the modules in Statiq take a delegate, basically a func, and it's a typed delegate of type config. And those can get a little bit tricky to create. So this config Statiq class has what amounts to factories to create these special delegates. And the idea is these delegates are run at generation time, depending on what the delegate is. So what I'm saying here is I want to set the content of each document using a value from that document is how you can read this. So this is going to look a little weird, and at the risk of confusing people, I'm not going to explain it entirely. But what we're doing here, enumerate values sets its own metadata value called current. Basically, because we're spitting out multiple documents, I need to stuff the item that was created from somewhere. So I stuff it into a key in that dictionary that comes along with the document called current. That's just part of the module. So that current itself contains a document. So I'm going to get that current value from the enumerate module and then get the string from its content value. So if we look back up here, that's matching up with this. So current, once I enumerate values, current is essentially this object, but represented as a nested document. Content then is this property and its value. It's not really important that you understand what's going on here, more that you kind of get the gist of we're building up complex functionality by parsing a JSON file and using modules to do interesting things with it. So now I'm going to go ahead and remember we've got this last step. So I've got one module, one document per value, but each document still has the name files JSON. That name rides along even after we exploded it. So now I need to add a set destination, just like we did up here, to indicate what I want the new name of my document to be.
Comma is missing. Yeah, it's fun. It's funny that you say that this looks complex, etc. What I think is it looks quite powerful, because the way how you do it, I mean, data just flows, and I mean it takes a moment to get used to probably, but this looks just powerful, I think.
Yeah, and it is. It's very powerful, and it's also, even though it looks complicated, the folks who have like kind of gone all in on Statiq and really learned how the framework works have kind of given feedback that it makes sense that as they're doing it, once you understand what's going on, particularly with documents and metadata, that the style of doing things does make sense. So, okay, now I've got my process phase done, and we just need one more thing. I want to output these to disk. So just like before, I'm going to add a write files module. Okay, so now I've got my new pipeline that reads my JSON file, parses it, explodes the array in the files property, sets the content of each document as a result from exploding that array, and sets the destination equal to the file name value. So you can probably guess what's going to happen when I run this thing.
Me.
Yeah.
I was taking a look at some other stuff meanwhile. So, well, one document per part of the item of the array, I would say. But like I said, I was looking at some other stuff meanwhile.
Yeah, so you can see we've got two pipelines, generate files and render markdown. They both ran concurrently, which is why we've got our timeline here showing that they both did their input phase and then their process phase. Rendering the markdown actually took a little bit longer than doing all that work with the JSON file. But when we come to our output here, you can see we've now output our text files with the correct content as defined in our JSON file. So you can start to kind of get a feel for some of the scenarios you could light up here. What if instead of reading a JSON file, I was reading an API from the web? You know, what if I had a bunch of XML files and I needed to convert those or transform them? What if I wanted to get stuff from a database? You know, I could make some database calls here and output a document per row in the database and then output stuff based on what's in the database. So you can see how this makes it, once you understand and really get a feel for this module flow and how the pipelines work, how it becomes really easy and powerful to string together these modules to create kind of arbitrary processing utilities.
I would say it doesn't look static at all.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all
powerful.
about inputs, processing those inputs, and generating outputs. That's really what we're talking about here. Oh, we have a question about the theme. The very first thing I do every time I install Writer is install the GitHub theme from the extensions marketplace. I absolutely love
not even the light theme, okay?
No, it is the GitHub theme, which is, I think, based on the GitHub theme for VS Code, which both use the standard. GitHub publishes their official style sheet. I just, for whatever reason, I really like all that to kind of be aligned. And since I can't change the style sheet GitHub uses, everything else has to get in line.
Okay, cool. So far, no other questions. Oh yeah, I remember that one actually, but I wanted to leave it for the end. Where was it? Here. The question is about how far this generating of API references is actually going already. Also, with the addition, how open is the project to new contributors?
Okay, so first question. I assume you're referring to when I was talking about taking enums from the API and converting that to an output. Is that?
Well,
or do you think
it was the.
Oh, you're talking about static docs. Sorry,
yeah, exactly.
I was total brain was somewhere else. Yeah, static docs. How far along are we in terms of generating documentation?
From XML.
Yeah,
text,
from
basically,
XML
yeah.
or from a assembly or source code. The answer is the static part is essentially done and has been for a while. The code part. The part that is proving a little bit more difficult is the theme. Right? If we ship static docs and there's no theme to accompany it, what you're going to end up with is a whole bunch of documents that represent all of the symbols in your source code or your assembly or your XML file. You'll end up with a whole bunch of documents, but nothing that does anything with them. So that's not fun. That doesn't create good documentation. So the part that needs work and that is progressing slowly but steadily is porting over the layouts and the razor from YAM that created that beautiful API documentation as HTML. That part is taking a little longer because there's a few breaking changes between the way YAM created that API symbol set and the way Statiq does it. So hopefully soon. I mean, I am my own worst critic in a lot of senses, and I really want to get that out the door for the Statiq site so that I can stop telling people to look at source code if they want to know like what modules are available. So I don't have a timeline though. This last year has been weird for everyone, and myself included. So yeah, we'll see. Hopefully soon. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say some time schedule, but I just can't.
Second question: How open are you
new contributors? I love new contributors. I am extremely passionate about .NET open source and the open source community. I have not once turned down a contributor. I generally, especially if it's your first time, I like to kind of work through the process in as much detail as you want and help along if you need some help getting that PR to a mergeable state. That's totally fine. Yeah, I love contributors. If someone out there is listening and would like to start looking at how to contribute, shortcodes are a great way because they're so easy to write and there's so much open potential there that's unrealized in terms of, we could write hundreds of shortcodes to do all kinds of cool things. So that's one area. There's something called analyzers, which I didn't even talk about today. That's another area that's kind of low-hanging fruit. There's a potential to write a lot of additional analyzers. Those are little bits of code that like verify correctness of your generation. Modules, there's always potential to write modules. Those are also not particularly difficult to write, and hence the name, they're extremely modular. So if there's some bit of functionality that you'd want to see Statiq do or that you're particularly adept at that we don't already do, writing a module is a great way, and then we can get that either into core or out there as an extension. So there's lots of good kind of modular extensibility points to look at. Or if you're feeling adventuresome, jump right in. I love framework contributions, even though the code is a little complex at this point.
Sounds great. I wish a lot of success with Hacktober, actually. Everyone remember that. I can just repeat it. It's a great project, and like you said, it's really like the small contribution that I try to push through are very very modular, very much of a unit. Let's say didn't take long to jump in. Like I said, we still hope to deliver something in the Statiq plugin. But I can't say anything official just yet. I think we need to have a little discussion a bit later about that. And yeah, maybe one last question before we wrap up. And it is, Ivan is asking, is there any kind of time triggers for pipelines, or we have different types of pipelines?
Yes, we do. There are a few different types of pipelines. It can get a little bit confusing, so I didn't talk about it, but let me bring up, I think the docs actually have a visualization, so I'll just try and bring that up real quick here. Let's see here. Maybe I don't have it. Okay, so I'll talk about it. So the idea with pipelines is they run at different times. And what I mean is you see here, I defined two, and they're running concurrently. I can create dependencies, and that then sets up pipelines to run in sequence, but only by phase. So, I talked about how pipelines have phases. There's 4 phases. The whole driver for the phases is around when a pipeline pauses to wait for other pipelines. So as a concrete example, if I made generate files dependent on render markdown, that would mean that they both run their input phase concurrently. The input phase always runs concurrently. So it's going to read in files all at once for every pipeline because we don't want to block on that. But then if generate files was dependent on render markdown, at that point, generate files would take a pause and it would wait for render markdown to do its work. And then it would start doing its work. Generate files would do its work once its dependencies have finished, so that it can read the outputs from the dependent pipelines when doing its own work. So you can, for complicated builds, and Statiq.Web does this a lot, you can actually create chains of pipelines that run at different times depending on what their dependencies are. And then if you want to completely break out of that, there's this thing called an isolated pipeline that will throw an error if it tries to use anything from any other pipeline. It's basically just do this work all the way through, don't care about anyone else. So an isolated pipeline is good for things like image optimization. You're not going to depend on that anywhere else, and you just want it to run as quickly as possible and finish. There's also things called deployment pipelines, and a deployment pipeline is run after all other pipelines are run and only if you trigger deployment. There's a flag to say run my deployment pipelines. So in your deployment pipeline, Statiq won't just do your generation. It also has built-in support for deploying to things like GitHub Pages and Netlify and Azure Statiq Web Host. If you want Statiq, the app, to do all of that and basically build and deploy your Statiq website, it can do that. If you want to do something similar yourself, that's where deployment pipelines come in. So once you start digging in, there are a lot of different kinds of pipelines, and the different kinds give clues as to how they interact with each other. It helps the engine determine when to run a pipeline and the modules it contains.
Very powerful.
Yeah, I mean,
again, it sounds like a great effort of and thoughts that have gone into this. And
yeah, I like to use the term incremental complexity. Statiq.Web is kind of the perfect example of that. There's a ton of complexity built in, just like in any major framework like ASP.NET, right? There's a lot going on under the hood that you can fiddle with. But we want to make that complexity incrementally available, in the sense that the happy path is super easy. It's, we saw it, it's 4 lines of code. You want to get a little more complicated? Okay, we'll make that a little bit easier to build like your own pipeline or whatever with Fluent APIs. You want to get even more complicated? Okay, you can open that box a little bit more. So at each kind of level of depth, you can dive into more complexity. And so there's a lot going on within the framework that you have access to if you need it, but most people won't need it, so we kind of hide it. It's that whole 90%, then 80%, then 70% thing, where you try and optimize for the 90% of use cases, Then you optimize for the slightly smaller city, and so on.
Sounds great. I would say we wrap up. Do you have anything, any last words regarding code? Otherwise, I would remove your screen.
No, I mean, I'll say one more thing about contributions, and it's kind of a more general, going along with Hacktoberfest coming up. Contributions take many forms. It doesn't have to even be code. Documentation contributions are always welcome, and that goes really for any open source project. Editing code comments, adding XML comments where maybe they weren't as descriptive as they could be. Anything like that is always welcome. I think I speak for pretty much every maintainer when I say anything you do that we don't have to do is a huge win, and we'd love to have people on board helping out.
Those were some great words. I also want to add thanks Dave for taking the time. It was really interesting listening to you talking about Statiq. I think it's a great thing. I can only encourage and recommend people to check it out. It has helped me a lot already, although I didn't even publish it yet, my work that I'm currently doing. So really just thanks from everyone, or in the name of everyone. And let's wrap up. I will share my screen once more. So if you want to find out more, then here are a couple of links for more information, like our .NET blog at JetBrains, also Twitter handle, and definitely also like and subscribe if you like this format. At this point, also thanks to the .NET Foundation channel, because we can co-stream on their channel as well. Down below, you also have the links for Dave to his blog, Twitter account, and GitHub account. So if you have any further questions, then I guess Dave would say feel free. Yeah, right. Yep. Okay, and with that, again, thanks for joining. Do make sure to like and subscribe if you liked it, and we will see you in the next episode pretty soon, I guess. So thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great.